Alright, what's up guys? Really excited to make this video because right now I am going to be boiling down the essence of what spiritual development is and also talk about how you can develop in a more efficient manner. So really all of spiritual growth can be boiled down to one simple concept, and that is vertical development. And it's called vertical development or vertical growth because it represents an increase in your consciousness, a leap to a greater perspective, an expansion of your worldview to a more holistic understanding of the greater picture, and then with all of that, your values and how you live your life change with that. Basically, to develop vertically is to see the world with a new lens, and the more you develop, the less selfish that lens is, and the more selfless that lens is. So a great example of vertical development that I came across recently was in famous YouTuber Johnny Harris's recent video about why he left the Mormon church. His entire life, this man had been a very devout Mormon. He had dedicated his life to the faith. He went on a 2-year mission in Mexico to help spread Mormon ideals after he graduated high school, and several years later, when his first son was born, he realized that Mormonism was not what he wanted to be teaching his kid as he was raising him. Harris talked about how he had gradually become aware of the cult-like nature of the church, with its emphasis on obedience to authority and suppression of self-expression and free thinking. And he also noted that he despised the homophobic and misogynistic structure of the church, and he realized that these were not the types of values he wanted to instill into his son, and were not ideal values just to project onto the world in general. So he left the church and has spent the last few years purging completely the Mormon framework out of his mind, and he has now found a powerful sense of freedom in no longer abiding by any particular belief system. So that's just one example, but it's also important not to confuse vertical development with horizontal development. Vertical development is the changing of the lens in how you view yourself in relation to the world. So it's a change in your meaning-making paradigm to one of increasing holism, which means a larger understanding of the greater whole in all of its parts. The more you vertically develop, the more your ego withers away. And all of this has nothing to do with what is called horizontal development, which is simply the act of learning new skills such as, say, singing or coding or playing basketball. So someone could literally be a genius and have like a 200 IQ and they're amazing at math and physics and understanding all of these formulas and all that stuff, but they could still be very spiritually or vertically underdeveloped because their worldview is still very narrow, they're still very selfish, they live strongly in ego, they're unaware of their biases, they're unaware of how their mind works, etc. So don't confuse vertical development with horizontal development, they are not at all the same. And being vertically developed as a human is infinitely more important than being horizontally developed. So before I get into how you can evolve in this domain, let's talk about the vertical development that the collective of humanity has undergone in the past few thousand years. So do you ever learn about history and think about how barbaric the people back then were? You know, burning people at the stake, cutting people's heads off at the guillotine, gladiator events where people would fight to the death and people would cheer on, empires trying to take over the world, constant war, religious inquisitions, all that sorts of stuff. Well, those things happened because the people back then were not nearly as vertically developed as the people today are. They viewed reality from such a narrow lens, and they lacked understanding of the greater picture, and you can't even blame them at all, you really can't. Today's humans are standing on the shoulders of giants. The only reason we can learn about our entire species' history and learn from our mistakes is because the people before us had to suffer the costs of making those mistakes. You can research and learn about literally anything you want to on the internet because of the genius, as well as the not so genius human beings that came before you that progressed the species to the point where you can do such a thing. You only have such an expansive worldview because all of the work that your ancestors did, and the world wasn't always like how it is today. If you were a human being like 2,000 years ago, or even 1,000 or a few hundred years ago, the exact time frame really isn't that important. The odds are you lived virtually your entire life within like a 20-mile radius. You only encountered the same few hundred people your entire life. You knew very little about different cultures, different languages, history, etc. There wasn't science like there is today. We didn't have any advanced technology that allowed us to be interconnected. We didn't even know the Earth was round until a few hundred years ago. We knew nothing about outer space, the solar system, other galaxies, other planets, black holes, etc. until very recently in humanity's history. And the people back then just knew very little about how reality worked, and they basically made stuff up and then lived life in alignment with whatever they made up. So people really truly lived in a bubble. In that tiny bubble they spent their entire life in, that includes their way of living, their culture, their customs, their values, their worldview, etc. was literally everything for them. They literally didn't know anything else. It was all about me and my people, and anyone that went against your people's customs and values were seen as a threat because, well, your people's customs and values were all that you knew. Very few people in history have had the luxury of learning about various different belief systems and values and customs and choosing whichever ones they liked best. No, they were culturally indoctrinated, and then they blindly went with whatever they were culturally indoctrinated with because they never even were presented with any alternative. And now today, humanity has progressed to the point where the entire planet is so interconnected that we'll know about a bombing that happens on the other side of the world within like 10 minutes. You can literally learn about anything you want on the internet for free, and people don't realize how much of a luxury that is, but even more so what they don't realize is how much that impacts the collective of humanity's worldview. With knowledge, your worldview can expand so much, and knowledge is truly a major catalyst for vertical development. Now, a fantastic model that showcases humanity's vertical development over the millennia is spiral dynamics. If you're not familiar with that model, then I highly suggest you check out my video on spiral dynamics after this one, because it will make your understanding of vertical development so much more rich, and will also provide you with a roadmap on how you can continue your vertical development beyond the center of gravity of today's society. But anyway, what that model will tell you is that our modern first world society is somewhere between spiral dynamic stage orange and spiral dynamic stage green. And stage orange is kind of like the very individualistic, very capitalistic stage. And I don't want to get too much into the specific details on the spiral dynamics model because I have other videos on that. But basically what the pitfalls of a strongly individualistic and free market capitalist worldview is that it's very egoic, it's very self-oriented, it's to view others as competition rather than companions, and this leads to all sorts of inequality problems, and this is where stage green comes in after stage orange. This stage green is basically like the social justice warrior stage with its emphasis on liberalism, LGBTQ rights, anti-racism, anti-authoritarian, anti-hierarchy, etc. And while that's all great, stage green suffers from toxic groupthink and can also become dogmatic as well. So what they try to do is they try to shove their liberal worldview down the throats of others, and what they don't realize is that forcing things onto others is not how you vertically develop them. So what happens with liberals and conservatives, at least in America, is that they just talk past each other and never see eye to eye. They never truly understand each other. They're very polarized. Politics in America is just so insanely polarized, very ununited. They're always bickering back and forth on how to run the country. And what you actually have to do is rise above that mentality. Stop just projecting your worldview onto others and trying to get them to conform with whatever you believe, which the spiral dynamics model would call this stage yellow, which is after green. And to do this, you really have to take a big picture view on reality. You have to recognize that society and all the worldviews of the people within it is just a buildup of a mix of various different systems, and that the world's problems can only be solved by non-selfish people who understand the dynamics of those systems at a very deep level. And to get more people to that level, people need to be educated in various different domains. So a very unconscious and not vertically developed person would use the statistic that black people commit crimes at a higher rate than white people within America in order to justify their racist ideals. And a more spiritually aware and vertically developed person would see that statistic and realize that the reason black people commit crimes at higher rates is not due to the way they are, which would be racist, but rather due to the entire overarching system at play, whose effects go all the way back to the days of slavery, that has put the majority of them at the bottom of the societal economic hierarchy, which also puts them at a lower tier on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which breeds an environment in which they are more likely to break the law in order to survive. So if you want to fix that, you have to fix the system that gives rise to that. So do you see how much more holistic the second viewpoint is than the first one? And you can only have the second viewpoint if you have the proper understanding on how the system works, which is why understanding is insanely important when it comes to vertical development. And there's a lot more to the domain of understanding than simply just having an education. Education is a huge part of it for sure, but an aspect of understanding that is also just as important as education is having a very deep understanding of your own mind and how it affects your day-to-day experience of reality. We can call this area of understanding consciousness work, and this includes things like meditation, contemplation, as well as the safe and proper use of psychedelic substances, as well as a few other areas. And what these can do is separate your own consciousness from your ego, which is simply just the mind's operating program, and through this, your blind spots can be revealed. You can become aware of your own biases, you can become aware of things that never would have been possible before, and most importantly, you can realize that the ego is not actually you, and this is the most important realization because the whole reason the world sucks is because everyone is so strongly identified with their egos. Now, I don't want to get too much into the spiritual realizations, I have other videos on that, but if you start doing consciousness work on top of educating yourself, you're going to be in like the top 1% of vertically developed human beings, and when you start living your life in alignment with that, you're truly going to be doing a service to humanity. And the reason my channel has so few views is because so few people actually are doing consciousness work, and that is precisely because it is threatening to their ego structures, and well, no ego wants to die, so you can't even really blame anyone. So the number one piece of advice I could give you to become the most spiritually developed human being that you possibly can is to combine increasing your own knowledge with consciousness work. So educate yourself on world matters, soak in new perspectives, read books, find out what you're passionate about, do all of that, but also combine it with daily meditation. Learn how to contemplate intensively. And also, if you're interested, you can learn how to use psychedelics in the context for personal development, which goes a long way in increasing consciousness and opening you up to the domains of realms beyond the ego, especially for beginners. And I promise you, if you're doing all of that and taking it very seriously, you're going to be a very spiritually developed human being. Remember, spirituality is not just doing yoga or meditation a few times or reading some Eckhart Tolle. No, it deals with increasing your own consciousness, taking a leap in perspective, taking on a more holistic understanding of yourself in relation to reality, and then trying to embody that and live your life in alignment with it. It's an extremely complicated and nuanced journey, which is why the spiritual path can be so lonely and is very unique to every individual. So I hope this video helped you understand the essence of what spiritual development is. Please give the video a like and drop a comment for that algorithm boost. And if you wish to support my work on a deeper level, I do have a Patreon. That would go a long way in helping fund my channel because, well, I don't make that much and I put a lot of work into this stuff. And as always, guys, have a great day and peace.